Chicago, the city of Chicago, where we are on the air, one of our main cities, broadcast cities, had an election recently, and the election seemed to me to be a really interesting one. It seemed to me something might be going on there in terms of some of the winds of change we've seen around the country, not only in the city as a whole, but perhaps, you know, in certain sections of the city, the 49th Ward, for example. But our next guest will know a lot more about that than I do. Rick Perlstein has been on the program before. Rick is a terrific historian and writer. He's written a number of books you should read if you haven't yet, including The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, preceding it, Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. He's got another book coming out in that series. Again, those books are recommended, and he joins us now. Rick Perlstein, thanks for coming on the program.
Hi, Richard. Great to be back.
Great to see you. Now, listen, was I right in my perception from far away Washington, D.C., that something interesting just happened in Chicago?
Very interesting. We're going to have an African-American female mayor. We had a massive 14-way mayoral first round of voting just this past Tuesday, following Rahm Emanuel's announcement that he's retiring and not running for a third term, very much because he was under fire for his terrible handling of a police shooting and his unpopularity involving some of his development strategies and all sorts of things. So we really put paid to one of the most maligned figures of Democratic Party neoliberalism. And in his place, these two African-American women, one of whom is a lesbian, Lori Lightfoot, who came in first place, and the other, Toni Preckwinkle, defeated the third place contender, who was William Daley, who's the son of course, Richard J. Daley, the boss, and the brother of Richard M. Daley, the guy who brought our finances to rack and ruin during the 90s. And this William Daley, the guy who had been kind of the neoliberal chief of staff to Obama, and the commerce secretary, who's obviously the guy who, you know, is the big business liaison to the White House. He got $2 million in donations from the richest man in Illinois, a hedge fund guy named Ken Griffin, who just bought a $200 million house in New York City, and he got his butt handed to him.
So that is, first of all, an emotionally satisfying story for someone like me. But secondly, you know, were people really surprised by this? Because I think, you know, the common conventional wisdom, I might guess, would be that Daley has the name recognition, he has the money behind him, that he would be the favorite, at least, to make it to the runoff status. Were people surprised that he was defeated by these two women?
Well, I think in this case, name recognition was a bit of a boomerang effect for Daley, because the last Daley left the city finances in such a shambles. And in Chicago politics, the two main variables are basically the machine and reform. And those are kind of rough symbols. There really isn't a machine like there was before they decoupled city hiring from political patronage. But there are machines. And there are centers of power. And in Chicago, reformers are the people who basically are for merit and progressive policies. And that's the way every election has been. And this was very much a reform election all the way down the ballot, and also in many, many of the 50 ward elections. So it wasn't a huge surprise, but it was a surprise. And it very much is of a piece of the wave of left-wing energy coursing through the country. It's quite possible that following the recall elections on the first Tuesday in April, that Chicago will have 6 of 50 aldermen who are members of Democratic Socialists of America, which would be the most number of socialists on Chicago's city council since 1910.
You know, that is fascinating. It gets to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, you know, I'm looking for the name now. Maria Hadden, 49th Ward. You know,
interesting result, yeah.
But you're so. I was going to ask you to place it in the context of what we're seeing, whether it's the defeat of Joe Crowley and the rise of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York City, or Ayanna Pressley's rise, beating Michael Capuano, and again, established Democratic politicians giving way in solidly Democratic districts by and large to strong leftists, including, you mentioned 6 of 50 being DSA members. Is this a kind of a cultural shift as well as a political shift for the party? I mean, we're going to see the kind of things we've seen play out a little bit in Congress, for example, where the old guard Democrats are kind of trying to figure out how exactly they want to live with and cohabit with their new leftist colleagues.
Absolutely. We have supposedly the Chicago Constitution. I don't know if it was a written constitution, but supposedly we have a weak mayor and strong city council. But that's only on paper. Do you want to push pause on the play there?
No. It's all right. We want every voice in Chicago to be heard.
That's Ziggy. So let me tell you. So I'm gonna bring it back to something I know, and I should actually give a full disclosure. I was actually precinct captain for one of these young aldermanic candidates, and my ward, which is the 40th ward, was a pretty good case study in this case. The fellow I supported was named Andre Vasquez, and the incumbent alderman is a fellow named Pat O'Connor, Irish name, and he's been an alderman since 1983, and in his very first year in the city council, he was under grand jury investigation, and he had earned the nickname City Hall Santa Claus because he hired so many family members. He's still in there. He is infamous for upzoning, basically changing the zoning in various areas of the ward, and then giving his wife, whose name is Barbara O'Connor, the keys to be the real estate developer. He's also an officer. He's the vice president and chief counsel of a bank in the ward, which obviously places him in a position to make all kinds of political favors. So that's what we used to call, or still call, the Chicago way. So he ran for re-election, right, for his whatever zillionth term, and there were 4 progressive candidates running against him. One was this 22-year-old Nigerian American. And the guy I supported was about a 30-year-old. He's a Hispanic kid, and 2 women. And when they had their first candidate for him, this old guy, this guy O'Connor, he'd never been challenged in this way before. He'd only actually faced the challenger once. That was 4 years ago, in which the challenger got 40% of the vote. And he was just kind of baffled to have to kind of answer for himself. And he did a terrible job. And at one point, he pulled out a flyer that the youngest candidate, who's the Nigerian American, produced for a fundraiser at the Nigerian Cultural Center. And he said, Ugo here isn't for the community. He's for Nigerian political power. And everyone just kind of gasped. I mean, I'd never heard anything that racist in a political event before. And that kind of set the tenor for the entire election. And he got 33% of the vote, which gave him first place. But the other candidates had the rest of the vote, and he's going to be in a runoff, and he's probably going to lose.
Who's he? So first of all,
just to give more background,
okay.
He's the replaced the guy who's probably going to jail for selling favors to Burger King owners at Burke. So that's the kind of changing of the guard we're talking about. And suddenly this city council, which votes for the mayor 48-2, 49-1 on very controversial things like giving away our parking meters to a consortium including the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Abu Dhabi, is going to be a real check on the mayor's power, whoever it is.
It's fascinating. But let me interrupt for a second just to say you might want to tilt your camera a little bit down for those who are following us on YouTube, just so we get they're perfect. Okay. Because I want people to get the full impact of everything you're saying. So it's fascinating. So so you have these people who, it does seem to a certain extent to reflect larger forces. You have these incumbents who come to view their offices as somehow like a divine right kings or something.
The guy in my ward almost passed his seat down to his daughter. He didn't at the last minute, but he tried. He was considering it.
Well, you know, at least he's not advocating primogeniture. He's willing to pass it. You know, he's
Not
not. It's
like,
not sexist in his inheritance practices. But so is the Nigerian in the runoff? The Nigerian American?
it's my candidate, RJ Vasquez, who's Hispanic.
Okay.
This guy's Nigerian's only 22 years old, and he's a real comer, you know, and he's a community organizer, and he's, you know, a great example of the kind of fresh wind that's blowing across Chicago politics.
Well, and it brings to mind something else too, which is it seems to me that there are two ways in which Democratic politicians of the old school can become obsolete in their thinking, in my opinion. And while some people put these two forces in opposition, I think they're actually complementary. One is they can fail to understand in my view, the economic forces at work along what might have historically been described as class lines. Okay, so economic obsolescence. The second is the failure to recognize and understand and be comfortable with and fluent in the cultural diversity that the Democratic Coalition has come to represent, whether it's immigrant communities, whether it's communities of color, whether it's communities with a distinctive language heritage or whatever, the notion of e pluribus unum, right? The idea that the party comes together as one and forms a community out of multiple communities, that kind of multicultural fluency, it seems to me, that maybe the old school of Democratic politicians in Chicago are suffering from that syndrome we've seen elsewhere, which is a lack of fluency in both these new political languages. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, that is really interesting in the case of Chicago in this election, because Chicago is an ethnic cauldron. And yes, obviously the power base has been, Irish Americans, the Dailies, Jane Byrne, and their various janissaries, the William Burkes, also white ethnics like Ed Verdoliak. And in order to have a progressive coalition, the reason Harold Washington was able to succeed in 1983 and 1987, it was about creating a coalition between African Americans and Hispanics. Now, this time it's really interesting because we have these two African American candidates and a state representative, very much a kind of a member of this young reform generation named Will Guzzardi, has created these precinct maps that show the spread of the vote between these two African-American candidates. Preckwinkle, who is this figure who really is kind of somewhere on the edge between kind of a machine politician and a reform politician herself. There's a real debate over, kind of which side of the line she falls on. She's the president of the county board, and she's also the head of the Cook County Democratic Party. And Lori Lightfoot, who on the one hand is this independent figure, but on the other, she's been involved in police review stuff. So people think that she's maybe too tied to the police. So there's this big debate over which is which. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at these maps, it turns out that Lori Lightfoot won overwhelmingly in all the white liberal wards, what they call in Chicago the lakefront liberals, and Preckwinkle won overwhelmingly in the African American wards. And there's lots of speculation about why that was. Well, maybe white voters are more concerned about corruption. Preckwinkle was tied to this compromised figure, Ed Burke, who might be going to jail. Or maybe it's because Lightfoot is a lesbian and she has been able to activate and mobilize gay and lesbian voters on the north side that haven't been particularly mobilized before. We're not really sure yet, but the vote still does fall very much, almost like there's if anyone wants to look this up, there's a public post by an organizer in Chicago named Tobita, Tobita Chow, and he has these maps on his Facebook page. And it's almost like looking at an ethnic map of Chicago to see who voted for whom. And suddenly the tie-breaking vote becomes this woman who was far down, 5th or 6th place, named Susan Mendoza, who was kind of a machine figure, but she was really the only viable Hispanic candidate. So that's kind of where the political lay of the land falls in the next basically 5 weeks or so when this runoff election falls.
Well, it's fascinating, and I guess I would close with this thought, because unfortunately we're going to run out of time, Rick, but I would close with this thought that, you know, a lot of us are always out repeating this mantra that change comes from below and is reflected later at the higher echelons of power. But I'm almost wondering if that isn't what we're seeing in Chicago here, and whether the changing nature of the city council isn't going to, you know, both these mayoral finalists seem to have their established mixed bag from the way you describe them, with threads of establishmentarianism in them. But maybe the future of Chicago will be written to a larger extent by the changing council that's going to push the mayoralty and therefore the city in one direction or another.
That's right. And the straw that broke that camel's back was both with city council and with the fall of Rahm Emanuel, very much 100% was the activists of Black Lives Matter and the journalists who flushed out this tape of this police shooting. And that completely was a change from below that no one at the upper echelons of power saw coming. And the business press in Chicago is kind of scratching their head saying, what do we do now? How do we work with these people? So it really is a people power revolution here in Chicago, but it's only the beginning.
Well, it's very exciting, and I'm delighted to follow it. And as far as Rahm Emanuel is concerned, I have a strict no Schadenfreude rule that I try to follow in my life. I may make an exception, but it's very exciting to see what's going on in Chicago. So,
you know what? I think Rahm is going to do just fine.
Yeah, I'm not worried about his...
He'll go back to his old job as an investment banker.
Right. I'm not worried about his fiscal well-being at all. So we'll have to leave it there. But Rick Perlstein, historian, author of a number of great books and more to come. Thanks so much for following this and for working the vote as you did as a precinct captain. And thanks for coming on the show.
Cheers. Talk to you soon.